My name's Linda Urban, and I'm the acting VP of Marketing for the ISPI Bay Area Boise State chapter. We're really excited. This is the first webinar that we've really done as a collective group. And Lisa and Rich, we're delighted to have you both here. This is Dr. Lisa Giacumo and Rich Peavy, both from Boise State. Lisa's a professor there. Rich is a graduate student, about 2/3 of the way through the master's program. They both have experience working in international NGOs, and I'm really thrilled that they're going to talk to you, all of us, about their experience there today. Okay, so let me turn it over to Lisa and Rich. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Linda, and thank you for your interest in our presentation today. So I recently heard a talk about how it's important for us as leaders and organizations to discover and harness our superpowers. And I think that relates really well to the kinds of gifts that we can bring to international NGOs. So in this presentation, Rich Peavy and I are going to show you that you too can share your HPT superpower gifts at a global scale for the greater good. Again, my name is Lisa. I'm a new professor this year in the Organizational Performance and Workplace Learning program at Boise State University. My current research interests focus on instructional design for training and performance support solutions, global training initiatives, social and digital media and training and performance improvement, and competency development in instructional designers. Also, I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Rich. Rich has managed performance support and training initiatives in nonprofit, public education, and the international humanitarian sector. In his current role in Samaritan's Purse International Relief, he serves as the International Projects Training Manager. His primary function includes building staff capacity of the organization's worldwide field staff and disaster responders across multiple languages and locations with limited infrastructure for staff and widely varied educational backgrounds. So that's a big job. To get us started, Rich is going to introduce an activity.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I think one of the things that we wanted to start this conversation off with is just to give you a little bit of context of some of the things that iNGOs, which stands for International Non-Governmental Organizations, face when they deal with humanitarian activities around the world. So what a lot of these organizations do is they have kind of a two-pronged approach. They're tackling direct issues at a community level, but at the same time, they're also developing and moving their staff capacity along as well. So those are some of the key components we want to just get your mind thinking about today. So on the screen here, I have a short little scenario that I want you to take just a couple minutes to read for yourself. And then there's a few questions underneath that. So take just a moment and read that scenario. And I'm going to make a couple connections for us as we continue on. So as you've had an opportunity to just quickly review that, I wanted to paint a little bit of a picture for some of the challenges that iNGOs face from a performance improvement or a capacity building perspective. And it starts out with this example here, a lady named Jiang. And Jiang is involved in a village that is frequently prone to human trafficking, mainly for economic purposes, but also for sexual exploitation as well. So when an organization like Samaritan's Purse or others tackles some of these performance issues, it may not at first appear like a performance issue to you, depending on your experience. So I have a couple questions for you that I'd like for you to respond to. And we'd like for you to take a couple minutes and answer that top question. So if you were in charge of helping the villagers in Jiang's village of coming up with some sort of performance improvement or some sort of solution to the challenges that they face, what might be some immediate questions that you would ask to tackle this issue? There's no right or wrong answer here. We just want to get the conversation started. So if you're brave enough, go ahead and type in some of those. Eva, thank you. Great question about stakeholders. If you haven't seen that question, you're not looking in the right chat box. So make sure you click that open and give us just a couple quick moments. I'm going to turn my mic off for a few moments and allow that dialogue to occur. and then we'll pick back up and make that connection. So keep your questions coming. Great. I'm seeing a couple more questions pop up. Wonderful. I'm going to give you another 10 or 15 seconds. What question might you first ask if you were charged with tackling this issue? These are some good questions. And frankly, I think you've done a little bit better than I anticipated as far as developing some of these questions. And what we're going to present throughout this session, just to kind of get things started, is that iNGOs, or again, international non-governmental organizations, tackle some of these unique questions that may or may not, depending on your experience, look like performance support problems to begin with. But we're going to present some information in today's session that kind of unpacks that a little bit and helps you understand a little bit about some of the unique resources and challenges, and also skills that learning and development professionals in iNGOs tackle. The other two questions that are on this page as we move on are ones that maybe you want to take a quick note of, maybe write down, because I'm going to come back to this at the end, and we're going to tackle this scenario at our closing as well, and finalize a few of these questions. So as we go on today, keep Giong in mind, and keep some of these challenges that we face in mind as we connect this to more of the performance support, performance improvement world you may be familiar with.
Thanks, Rich. And thanks for your participation. So by the end of this presentation, we hope that you are able to at least have a beginning competency to translate common instructional design and performance improvement terminology that's used in consulting work with iNGO clients. We hope that you will be able to compare instructional design and performance improvement work in iNGO contexts with corporate, for-profit, nonprofit, and academic contexts. And we also want you to be able to recognize some of the unique challenges faced by performance improvement professionals in iNGO contexts. And if for some reason you need a refresher at some point in the future, you will be able to access this recording from the Boise State University Organizational Performance and Workplace Learning webinar series archive on opel.boisestate.edu website. So what I want to start with first is talking a little bit about my path from working with community colleges, for universities, at for-profit organizations, at non-for-profit organizations, and eventually iNGOs as an instructional designer and HPT professional. So through my path, I realized that each group of people often uses slightly different language, but with similar meanings. And also, I realized that sometimes people use the same words, but then they kind of mean a little bit different of an idea depending on where you're at. So it's kind of like a math problem or a puzzle. It can feel really hard at first when you're trying to build a shared mental model, but persistence and compassion for others as well as yourself when working in capacity development is key. And once you realize the aha moment, it suddenly feels worth it. Also, I learned that if you can employ your client's language to communicate a path forward, it becomes much easier to achieve project goals with experts who may not know much about HPT, but bring very needed perspective to the table. So here's what I learned while working with iNGO professionals. Capacity building is the first term you'll see. It's used by international development, humanitarian, and disaster response professionals. Capacity building is all about talent development and improving performance on 3 different levels, including individuals, organizations, but also society. So the crossover for HPT professionals happens at the level of individuals in communities like Giang, individuals in organizations similar to where I worked in Oxfam GB, or where Rich works with Samaritan's Relief International, as well as at organizational systems inside of these organizations and the organizations that they partner with. Training is another term that has some unique meaning to iNGO professionals. For iNGO and international development professionals, training really includes everything from traditional classroom-based experiences to coaching, to mentoring, to job shadows, to secondments, to job aids, e-learning, online learning, blended learning environments. All of that means for an HPT professional, we would call that, or we would refer to those ideas underneath the umbrella of workplace learning. So that's where that kind of crossover happens. But there are some other terms that sound the same on the outside, however, on the inside of these groups have slightly different meanings. And one of those terms is sustainability. For someone who works in an iNGO, sustainability means that you create things that will be self-sustaining and work at an increasingly larger scale than where you started. So, but for most HPT professionals, sustainability really refers to the ability to self-maintain or self-nurture. We talk a lot about it as do no harm, or the triple bottom line, which is people, planet, and profit. Another term with a different meaning, but sounds the same, which surprised me personally, was the concept of diversity and how to respect and honor it across the globe. So for Americans, diversity often means that you include everyone in one corporate culture. However, when you look at it through the iNGO lens, it often means that you include everyone, but in most instances, you also have to accept their different cultures, which in some areas of the world actually means that people like to keep certain groups separate for a time. And this perspective can require you to change your HPT approach to meet the capacity development goals. Notice that we'll be using capacity development today. However, there's a lot of common ground between iNGOs and HPT practices. And a lot of the work that people with our superpowers do in capacity building is pretty similar to what we do in HPT as well. So you'll see that in iNGO, the work really embraces systematic process as well as systemic thinking. Ethical behavior is key, and there's really a huge emphasis on the value of their stakeholders. Inside of capacity development projects, individuals work very hard at aligning solutions with strategic goals. Any recommendations that I could provide had to be connected to valued results. And most of the work is collaborative and very iterative. It all has to be based on evidence-based practice because you have so little resources and you really need to do so much. Waste of any kind is just not an option.
So one of the things that this gets to the question next is, so we've paved some common ground. So what are some tools that you might be familiar with that are also important in iNGOs? And I've got some performance improvement tools that I have listed here on the screen that have been personally valuable to me as an iNGO learning and performance professional. And I want to just talk very briefly about how each one has benefited us in ways that you might be familiar with, but I also want to give you some context of how they might be a little bit different. For instance, let's start with a behavior engineering model. And that's something that you may be very familiar with depending on your coursework or your background or your professional experience. But it's one of those things that is particularly valuable for us in the iNGO world because so much of what we do, the interventions that we design, the performance that we're looking to improve is multi-layered and multifaceted. So when we're able to look at different impacting factors like motivation and resources and incentives, and I'm able to have conversations with people to help them understand that it's more than just a training issue. Because a lot of times when we want to approach something, let's take Jiyoung's example that we started out with. We want to approach it from, well, maybe they need knowledge of how to recognize human traffickers. Well, that could be true, and that's a very important piece to consider. But we also need to consider some things along the lines of motivations and incentives and resources that impact why human trafficking is even successful in that area. There's got to be something there, and many of your questions actually alluded to that, which I thought was very insightful. So being able to branch out beyond just a conversation of training is something that's important. And this behavior engineering model helps us do that and helps us do that very well. So again, a tool you're probably familiar with, but something that we use to kind of broaden the conversation with people who may or may not be familiar with performance improvement or capacity building initiatives. So that's something that's important. One of the tools that my organization has crafted around this is an online learning portal. So we have an online learning portal that's specifically available to our staff, and it includes more than just training material. A piece of that includes coursework, But another important, just as important piece includes an online learning community where our program managers are able to speak with technical experts, are able to share information back and forth to further flesh out some of the challenges that they face. So in opposed to just applying learning to our staff or to our beneficiaries, we need a conversation where we can have discussions about what are some of these other factors that play into that. And our online learning portal gives that community focus, that community approach, as well as the coursework to support that. So that's one of the ways that we have particularly used performance improvement tools in our organization. The other is something that is referred to in iNGOs as the project management cycle. And it varies slightly from iNGO to iNGO, but by and large, it has 5 or 6 main components. And those components are used very similarly to how an instructional design professional would follow an ADDIE model or a similar model along those lines. It takes an individual through the process of identifying the need for an intervention. In this case, it wouldn't be a performance intervention directly, but maybe it's a problem. So we focus a lot on problem-based design, and we look at things like, why does a particular community have high rates of disease? And we start looking at the common parts of that program cycle of doing an assessment, figuring out where the challenges are, looking at potential roadblocks. Then we go into designing particular interventions. And I'm summarizing this very succinctly here. There's a lot of more pieces that go to that. Ongoing monitoring and evaluation is another piece. And then finally, evaluation. So there's a standard cycle that most iNGOs follow when they develop their projects and take them through to completion. That's very similar to what we as learning and performance professionals do in our industry with following a design model, for example. The third one there is Kirkpatrick's evaluation model. And recently I returned from a trip to Haiti where I got to see this play out in Samaritan's Purse staff that we've been working with for over a year. This tool has really helped us craft some conversations around the expectations we have of our staff after training. I just returned last week from delivering part 3 of a training series that we began, like I said, about a year ago. And after the first training, we saw, wow, we were invested in. The staff that we worked with were encouraged. They felt good. They felt like that the organization had invested in their capacity, and they enjoyed it. Um, some changes happened, but by and large, it was an encouragement. Okay, we went back in July and delivered a part 2 to that training, and that's when we saw it kind of go from, wow, this is encouraging, to this has some really valuable content that we need to apply to our particular programs. In this case, we were teaching them how to deliver effective training to the people that they work with directly in these impoverished communities. So they were designing and delivering training, and now they were actually applying or being able to remember some of the lessons that we had taught them. We were having conversations about this in months after the training, still fleshing out exactly how that looked like, but we were able to pull that knowledge and information out of them. They were getting the concepts. And finally, this third training that I delivered just recently to them was kind of the culmination of, okay, now we expect to see your behavior start to change. So investing with our staff in some of those strategic ways and looking at like Kirkpatrick's model as indicators for how people should behave and how those reactions should morph into learning, should morph into behavior, and eventually we hope to see some really powerful results from that. So that's one example from that. And then the final example I have for performance improvement tools is ISPI's HPT model. And that's something that we actually are growing to love more and more here, but maybe not for the reason that you think. We've used it to actually help two kind of divergent areas of one of our country offices come to a common understanding about certain realities. And let me explain further what I mean. In our Liberia country office, for example, we have a side that deals with operations, and we have a side that deals with programs. And they have very specific processes and procedures that they follow. And they don't always understand or work well within those systems when it comes to cross-functional work. So we were able to take that HPT model and to sit down together as a group and start outlining, okay, what are our organizational values? What are the realities of some of the environments that we work in? Okay, what is the desired performance we're going for? And to sit down as a group of two divergent areas of our office to sit down and come up with these common goals together not only helped build the performance component, but it helped become a unifying factor in what we were talking about. As Lisa mentioned earlier, it's important, it's really important for us to have buy-in from a lot of these different stakeholders and to respect that diversity that we have amongst our staff. So as opposed to implementing one top down, this is how it has to be, it really is important for ingos, and ours especially in this instance, for us to make sure that we had a common understanding as we built those human performance technology issues. So we were able to then go and talk about, okay, so what are some good possible interventions here, and then how are we going to implement this, and then how are we going to check later to see if this follows up. So we were able to look at systems and process through the lens of walking in each other's shoes while we walked through this HPT model. So some common tools, some things that we use that you're probably familiar with, but maybe just a little bit of a different tweak on how we use them.
Great. Yeah. And that reminds me of a lot of the products that I was able to build, as well as working as a performance improvement and training specialist within Oxfam. We built online learning very similar to what you see available in a lot of universities, although discussions, while they happen in the context of reflection, often here in the university environment, discussions, as Rich mentioned, in an online learning environment in the iNGO world, are often about solving actual problems that people are running into right now, today, on the job. But they're also using e-learning, especially to get baseline knowledge about their roles and their functions in the organizations when they're coming on board, or to help disseminate to the trainers who will go and work with people like Xiang. We've built beyond blended learning solutions, meaning that you have some face-to-face training supported with some online training and possibly some multimedia as well. We create design documents, we create facilitator guides and participant guides. I've built educational websites. We use a lot of open source software, such as WordPress and the LearnDash plugin, to create an LMS for different organizations and consortiums. But most of the materials that I created were designed as open source materials with the most liberal Creative Commons license you can possibly choose. So that means that they're freely available online to download, use, modify, and even commercialize. So to build these products, we use the common ID tools that you learn about as either a professional, or when you formalize your practice and pursue a master's degree in something similar to what we have at Boise State University. So common tools such as, an environmental analysis and learner analysis. While we may not collect necessarily survey data or performance data from a computer management system, we do collect a lot of data and make database decisions. The data that we collect, though, are gathered through talking with stakeholders and building relationships with internal colleagues as well as external partners. So it's really, really common to sit in a room and gather the key individual stakeholders to update project planning, make decisions, and build products together. Through rapid prototyping, some design thinking strategies, and all of the materials that we build are aligned to industry held standards and competencies that will work for the beneficiaries no matter where they're at. So to continue on, I wanted to share a little bit of perspective and contrast some of the differences that you'd find working through organizations that are for-profit, nonprofit, and universities. When you work for a for-profit as a HPT professional, you have tons of resources available at your fingertips. There are a lot of specialized roles that you get to work with as an instructional designer or an HPT specialist. You have computer programmers, you have software developers, you have graphic artists, audio technicians, just a plethora of individuals to help you get your job done, whatever it is, and achieve the goals of the project. It's common to outsource help. It's easy to do. It doesn't mean you get something done faster, but it does mean that you have a deeper bench and you can kind of do a lot more work at once. Your primary work is as a service provider consultant, which usually includes some level of status. You often are seen as an expert in time if you're internal. And if you're external, you have to sell that very quickly and earn your place at the table pretty fast. Inside of a university setting, our practitioner work is often very predictable, it's very stable, it's very routine. You're a service provider consultant still. Sometimes you have a little less status, but you're usually seen as having a lot of technology expertise. However, when you go work in an iNGO or even some US-based nonprofits, you have a huge chance to be a really big influence in what's going on inside of the organization. You get to work on standardizing approaches, which are often not standardized and constantly evolving, but that's always the goal. People there are generally very open to new ideas within reason, of course. But you're responsible for pretty much everything. You design, you build, you market, you analyze, you do everything. And you do have opportunities to outsource on occasion, but not as much. And then also a unique aspect of working in iNGOs is that you're seen as a partner consultant and an expert after a very short time. So you get a little more status there because you're expected to do so much and you have so many responsibilities.
And with that kind of different perspective and how it varies a little bit from maybe a traditional environment, either in a corporate or academic, or even a U.S.-based nonprofit, there's some unique challenges, and we could have an entire session on what those unique challenges are. And I'm not going to highlight every single one here you see on this screen, but I do want to touch base on just two or three, so you can get just a little bit of a picture about some of the unique challenges iNGOs face, but also some of the unique opportunities that it presents to make an impact and to have some of that influence that Lisa mentioned just a moment ago. The first one I want to mention to you is culture. And this is one where it's pretty easy to apply the thought that if an international non-governmental organization is providing humanitarian relief activities in a very impoverished or devastated nation, either through war, natural disaster, or whatever, there's going to be some cultural differences. And that seems to be a given. But what we may not immediately realize is that those cultural differences go a little bit deeper than just understanding that people look different or eat different things, or they have different government structures. When you start digging into capacity building for those particular individuals, you start to realize there's some issues related to gender roles. There's some issues related to discrimination or non-discrimination. There's some issues related to their preferred absorption and respect for authority. So even the way that you present information can be unique. I want to give you one example of how I've seen that happen in one of the capacity building initiatives we had in a local community where we were working. Our staff went to they had done the appropriate assessments. They knew what the target problem was, and it was a lack of knowledge. And when they went to go deliver that particular knowledge, it became apparent from a cultural perspective that while the women in this particular village were the ones that required that knowledge and they needed that information, they needed their skills built, the men in that village were the ones that were required by culture to be delivered that we were delivered that training to. So something that we could have, continued to fight that battle and gone back and forth and said, no, we as performance professionals, as staff development people, we're going to define the audience. We're going to deliver training to the audience. But that culture didn't see it quite that way. So we had to overcome a barrier there, where that training had to be delivered to the men of the village, and it eventually opened doors where we were then able to deliver that to the women in the village to could get the knowledge and skills that they needed in that particular circumstance, but it wasn't what we could have done up front. So we had to kind of check our HPT hats at the door and say we've got to go another step farther to make this happen. So that's one example. The second challenge I wanted to bring up to you was urgency. A lot of times we're expected to engage with limited preparation for something that has a significant expectation. And an example of that, a couple years ago in Liberia, actually in a good 3 countries in West Africa, the Ebola virus consumed 3 particular countries, Liberia being one of those countries. Our organization and many others as well were involved in that humanitarian relief activity. And there was an incredible urgency there to get material out into communities, this knowledge of how the virus was transmitted, what were the symptoms, and how to prevent it were literally life-saving pieces of information. So this urgency and this pressure with very limited time for preparation, it had to be done now and it had to be done well. And that sense of expectation that we really don't have much room for failure here. If we don't communicate that information well, then we could be putting people's lives at risk. So that urgency, that expectation that's there to get it out quickly, because there are things more pressing than product delays or rollout of a particular new system or software that kind of force NGOs into this limited preparation, significant expectation mindset. And then the last one I wanted to mention to you is the goals point there listed on your screen. iNGOs have a different set of goals and priorities. A lot of times, training is seen as an expense because one of the key metrics in our industry is keeping what's called cost per beneficiary low. And that basically means that the lower we keep our costs per beneficiary that we serve, the more we can serve. So the idea is to serve more with as little as possible. So those goals sometimes cause some significant challenges when it comes to defining exactly what measures success. We measure success many times by how much money we've spent and how quickly we've spent it and how much we've served. So those are some key things, and a lot of our goals are measured not on what we do as an organization. We're measured a lot of times on what our beneficiaries do. So these people in these impacted communities that we're serving, either directly ourselves or through local partners, we're measured on what they do, not necessarily on what we do as an organization. So those are some unique challenges and some ways just to give you a glimpse of some of those areas in which iNGOs may differ a little bit from the experience that you're familiar with. I also wanted to mention to you some ethical considerations here. And you can see a quote on the screen from Voltaire. And he says, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And that's something we have to continually remind ourselves of as iNGOs. And maybe that's true in your profession as well, but it's certainly something that we have to speak to a lot. And Lisa has some good experience with that as well, based on our conversations. And that's something that if we continue to strive for that perfection, continue to strive for having everything done the way we would want it done in a normal environment, quote unquote, or in a way in accordance with how you would do this in an ideal circumstance, the way you design training, the way you identify what interventions are necessary, the way that you document what performance is desired versus current. And those are all things that we have to keep in mind in context with the people that we're serving, because of the nature our work is a little bit different and unique. We're providing water in places that don't have it, food to people that don't have it, shelter to people who've had everything wiped out. So these are considerations we're constantly going back and forth of as staff capacity building professionals, learning professionals, that we want to make sure we keep our eyes focused on what is excellent, what is good, but also understanding that sometimes we won't hit that mark, and it's okay. A couple other ethical considerations to put on your mind is that many iNGOs feel a deep responsibility to the national staff that they employ. When they go and begin working in a particular country, many times it's because that country's been devastated, is impoverished, and has very little resources. That typically means that the education system in that country is pretty poor. So the staff members that we hire and employ, we take great responsibility in building those staff members into people who can go into roles and responsibilities after our organization leaves the country, that continue to provide influence and benefit long after we've gone. It's that concept of sustainability that Lisa mentioned earlier, and how NGOs look at that a little bit differently maybe than some other organizations do. But that's important because as we build our staff capacity for our own performance, we're also looking to see maybe these are the future local leaders, or people who will make a larger impact in the country long after we're gone. So we do it for the performance of our own organization, with an eye always on what is good for these people, because their educational opportunities have been very, very limited. I've never had a piece of paper with a training title and date become so valuable as I have in some of our country offices, where just getting a certificate for attending a training has been a cherished piece of recognition for them, because they know they can take that on into other employment opportunities, and they can document what they've learned and what they've done. So we take that pretty seriously as well. And then the last one I wanted to mention to you, there's lots of others, but we want to make sure that we're coming in with an appropriate respect for the culture and the communities that we work in. So there's some pretty specific expectations that iNGOs have of themselves and of each other, that we're not imparting our cultural norms onto these cultures inappropriately. Some of these things, like, good hand washing techniques and how diseases spread, those are things we need to shift those norms. But there's some things we have to realize we're not there to change. As much as we might disagree with how the culture is structured or set up, we're there to serve, and we're there for a particular purpose. So as we seek to improve performance or knowledge in particular areas, we have to keep that in mind about our cultural aspect, and how we do or do not project some of our values that we may not even see we're projecting into some of the interventions that we put in place. So I wanted to mention those to you, as perhaps not that ethics isn't important in most organizations and in most industries, but it's uniquely applied, I think, in some of these iNGO capacities.
Right. And in the end, I can tell you that if you go and work for an iNGO or an NGO, you will most definitely have an amazing experience. And I wholeheartedly recommend it, especially if you want to share your superpowers with those who need it most. The last few thoughts that I wanted to leave you with, that relate to what I learned from working with some of the most passionate people that I've ever met, are that relationships really are first. Technical HPT or ID knowledge is applied with care and balance. You are a partner. That's a great feeling. For people who like working on a team, this is a prime spot to steer and facilitate collaboration. For those of you who love to network and connect people with each other, you really should think about working on capacity development projects. Customer service is always important, but sometimes regulations and emergencies, as Rich was saying earlier, interrupt service. So you have to be really flexible and very patient. You're also allowed to have some personal needs. It is humbling to be treated by an employer with empathy and care as an important and human individual. And I know that all employers strive to do that, but an iNGO and an NGO is really a unique kind of climate and experience.
And the final thing, and this goes to a question that was presented earlier in the presentation, is that how can you get involved? Is this something that interests you? Is there something that maybe you're not interested in changing careers, but what are some opportunities that are available to support um, organizations that are doing good for humanity, and what are their motivations, and what does that look like? So I want to just quickly share a couple options with you. One, I think the NGO community is always looking for excellence in particular areas, even though we don't always have time to become deep experts in human performance technology, it doesn't mean experts in human performance technology can't be utilized. That's not true at all. In fact, one of the best ways to I think get involved in something like this is to geographically look at the organizations that may be located near you and offer up some of your services in a volunteerism model, and to say, listen, I've got some of these expert skills that I'd like to see if there's any way you can utilize those and leverage them. I spoke with a lady on a plane coming back from a conference one time, and she said, "This is great. My team has been looking for something to get involved. We allocate 10% of our time every year, our design time, to pro bono projects. So maybe your organization does something similar to that. Maybe your team is involved in something along those lines. International non-governmental organizations are a great avenue for that. Perhaps you're thinking this is a possible career opportunity. There's a lot of need in this field. We talk about it a little bit differently. It's not always at the top of the radar, but I would put forth that most of what we do, the root of it at the end of the day, it relates back to the human performance technology side of things. We're looking at problems, we're designing interventions for that to improve performance. We may not call it that in my industry often, but that's really what we're doing. And if we go back to our example earlier and start unpacking some of those questions that I gave you in that very opening scenario, we start pulling out that the reason that we're doing some of these questions that we first ask begin to unpack the reason that, yes, this is probably a learning and staff development issue. We start looking at things as, does it have the makings of a performance improvement problem? And asking questions like, how do we compare current performance to desired performance? That question alone, I think, highlights the need that this is bigger sometimes than we may think. So human performance technology has a deep embedded component into the work that iNGOs do. And whether you get in that from a volunteerism perspective, or you're looking at it from an employment perspective, it's an industry that's got its challenges for sure, and has its stresses, but one that I truly enjoy working with and am happy to be a part of. For those of you that might be thinking about career options and what that might look like, there's two organizations that I would recommend, and I'm putting them in the chat as we speak. The first is Inside NGO, and Inside NGO is a industry organization for NGOs that includes a job forum. In fact, they list it right there on their homepage, and that gives you an opportunity to kind of explore and look around. The other one is an organization called iNGOs. It stands for Learning in NGOs. Learning in NGOs, iNGOs. And that's one of the organizations that I try to stay pretty connected with, because they do a lot of different things when it comes to providing opportunities for volunteerism and connecting other NGOs together in a consortium model to kind of leverage the power that they have together as opposed to individually. So lots of opportunities to do that. And I think some good resources for you there if you check out those two sites.
Great. So it looks like we still have about 10 minutes to field some questions. I noticed that some people have already typed questions into the chat box. So we'll go up to the top. Let's see. So Aiva asked a question about if we were aware of paying job opportunities in iNGOs that do not require relocation. So if you are lucky enough to live in a large metropolitan area, you likely have at least an NGO in the area that you could check out their career or work for us, or every organization has a different link on their website, but they do place opportunities on their websites. For international virtual work, that's often, I think, and I'll let Rich give his perspective on that too, but I often find that if you want international virtual work, you are generally hired on per project as a consultant. And you hear about these opportunities through joining different listservs. that where people who work in iNGOs talk about their needs for additional people. Rich, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that that covers it well. I think a lot of what you'll find, the virtual work is typically more contractual, and more less permanent, more kind of sporadic. But not every one of them requires a full-time commitment. So it may be that you're able to kind of consult or provide some of that on the side. But I do think if you're looking for like virtually based INGO work, it's out there. It's harder to find from an international perspective, simply because a lot of a lot of people that hire have there's a lot of contextualizing and conversations that happen, and NGOs tackle that different ways. But they're out there. They're just harder and fewer and far between. I think your best option for something virtually is more of the consulting contractual type basis.
Great, thanks. Um, let's see. Sue asked a question about how much interactivity is built into e-courses. Sue, that's a great question. And I think it really varies depending on who the designer is and what team they're working with. I can tell you that the e-courses I have seen, there are what you might consider interactions in terms of clicking and revealing sometimes, or scenario-based multiple choice questions. Sometimes you'll even find branching scenarios in some of the courses. Um, there is a really good example, a couple of really good examples on a woman that I recently met who works out of Australia as an instructional designer. Her website blog is called the E-Learning Nomad, and she has posted some of the products of her e-learning work that are very engaging and hours long. Actually, it's very interesting. She writes a pretty interesting blog. You might want to check that out.
Thank you.
Rich, do you have anything to add? You're welcome. So, Rich, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I just wrote down e-learning Nomad. I'm going to check that out myself. That sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah. It looks like when we have another question, when we have an urgent situation and you have to be able to come up with interventions that will work quickly, what does that imply for how PI practitioners need to prepare to be ready to respond? So I think Rich and I probably, we may have some different answers to that. From my perspective, working at Oxfam with the supply and logistics department, if we did our work well, honestly, then people who we worked with were able to respond and do their work well. And we weren't necessarily as impacted as performance improvement specialists as the people that we were working with. They were the ones that were generally called up quickly and often to go into emergency situations. We did, people in the department, performance improvement practitioners, were called upon to go visit remote places where not very many Americans ever see, but it was generally in times of peace where you could actually build capacity of the organizations and the employees that were over there and volunteers that were working, that would be called upon in a response, an emergency response. But I think that context varies depending on the organization and what department you're in, and then what role you have as a performance improvement practitioner. Rich, do you have anything to add to that?
Our organization has a large emergency disaster response component to it. And one of the biggest challenges that we face, I'm not sure if this is directly related to your question or not, but one of the biggest challenges we face is how do we keep that roster of disaster responders prepared and ready to go at a moment's notice? What are some things that we as learning and development professionals can do or should be doing to keep those people kind of ready and charged up and ready to go when they're required? And that's been a challenge for us. I think we've got a few things that work, that we have a standard just-in-time training module that we deploy once we know we're sending someone into a disaster impacted area, that they take no matter how many times they've deployed with us, no matter what what their timeline is that they go through that just-in-time training module. It's less than an hour. It refreshes on some of the key structures and pieces that we use in our disaster response, just as a refresher. And then it includes a small piece at the end that is very specific to that disaster. And it includes things like, what are the contexts on the ground? What are some things they need to know before they get there? What's the current scope of our response? And what are we doing and what are we not doing in this particular humanitarian emergency? So we're trying to work on ways to engage our disaster response roster, if you will, those being learners that are um, hired by the organization, and they sit on a waiting roster ready to deploy. A big challenge for us is keeping them engaged. And the best way to do that is kind of taking off, I think, a training hat sometimes and saying, how do I just remind them that we're here and that we're out there? So I'm not sure if that directly responds to your question, but it's one that, to stay ready, we've had to employ kind of some marketing techniques in addition to some of our performance improvement and training development pieces to keep our disaster responders ready to go and trained up and up to date on what they need to know.
Great.
Really interesting. I'm just struck that about needing to think about the audience. I mean, really, you're talking in a way about really understanding what that audience needs and relating the intervention to support them.
It certainly is a challenge, especially when we start looking at kind of the diverse skill sets that we employ too. We employ doctors, medical doctors on that list. We employ logisticians. We employ people who have been working in the humanitarian aid sector for decades. So we've got a huge gamut of experience and perspective there that we want to leverage, but at the same time we want to standardize into our process, because we know that if we have a process that works and it's in place, it's going to allow us to respond quicker and more effectively. So it is a challenge, and we certainly have our days when we wonder what in the world we're doing, but we've found some things that work, and I'm sure other iNGOs have as well.
I was trying to find the link that I came across a couple weeks ago with the example e-learning modules. And if you want to send me an email, I'm not seeing it right now as I'm quickly trying to search, but if you want to send me an email, my email address is included on the next slide, and I'll send you links to some of the stuff that I've seen out there.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So we're just about at the top of the hour. We should probably officially close, and anybody who needs to wrap up and bail out for your next event, please feel free to do so. Lisa and Rich, however, if you want to linger for a few minutes with any final comments, you certainly are welcome to.
Well, I just want to say thank you again to both Lisa and Rich for an engaging presentation. I learned a lot, and it's kind of exciting what you do. It just takes on another dimension.
Thank you so much. You're welcome. Yeah, we I know we both enjoy doing this kind of work, and being able to help other people discover how they might share their superpowers on a global scale.
Yeah, terrific presentation. So thanks very much. It also makes me wonder whether there might be some interesting angles there for graduate student projects.
For sure.
Rich, you're perfectly positioned. If you see any corners.
I'm willing to tap into any support you want to push my way.
So maybe you should make a quick little wish list of, you know, the kinds of projects that people wind up looking for, at least through the Opel program. You could certainly circulate that to the faculty.
You know, one of the things I've done, and it may be a little premature to mention it, but the Lingos organization that I try to stay pretty connected with, I've asked them directly to reach out to the Opel program. So I'm kind of putting a little public pressure on them right now
Cool.
to reach out to the Opel program, because I do think there's a lot of ways we can leverage the academic faculty and also the graduate students there to kind of make this go a little bit farther than what iNGOs can do on their own. So I would love
Right.
to see a tighter connection between iNGOs, especially a consortium of iNGOs, and into some of the academic perspectives and really solid models that work that we can leverage a little bit better.
That's a great idea. So I know I've heard of that organization before from Lisa. I think you've presented there, right? At their
Yes,
conference?
actually, that's where Rich and I originally met. We didn't know we were both going to be there. We didn't know that we were both representing at some level Boise State until we
So
ran into each
it might
other.
be interesting just to sort of spread the word out there about that conference. Also, maybe there'd be some good bridges
Right.
for
I think
students
for
and
that
for
particular
faculty.
one, you might need to be associated with a member organization. However, you know, in addition to project work inside of courses, which sometimes can be a challenge, if there's other opportunities that you that we might be able to explore for independent studies with more messy problems, that's something that we could consider as well. And if you're interested in thinking about independent studies with me in this area, please send me an email. And independent studies can be anywhere from 1 to 3 credits.
I feel like you should probably put that announcement somewhere on the Boise site. That would be great. If you want to stretch that far, you might get
Yeah, I
more
always
than you bargained
offer
for.
when I hear people interested and they have an idea that matches with what I'm trying to get done right now. Yeah, I throw that out there, but for sure.
Great.
Okay, well, thanks very much. This was really a terrific presentation.
One of the nice things about independent studies too, I don't know if anybody's still here or not, but it looks like we have 8 people, is that you know, if we choose to do it in a certain way together, if we build it in a certain way, it can also lead to conference presentations, which is a nice way to network with people and meet people in the greater ISPI community who may also help you in the future with landing your first iNGO position. I know we have people that are connected with USAID and other organizations as well. That are invested in Opel and ISPI and helping spread the good word for everybody.
Thanks again. Have a great afternoon, evening, everybody, and hope to see you at another one of these.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda.
You're welcome.